is not going to be about flight training or career topics. It's going to be about winter operations and how dangerous they really are. We had a recent accident in Bangor, Maine, but there have been others. One of the biggest problems that we have is human factors as it relates to having people try and fly when they shouldn't. Maybe because most of us drive cars and the weather hasn't ever really stopped us from driving from point A to point B. A lot of people get conditioned to just go. But the stakes are far higher when you're in an aircraft and not driving, and the consequences can be catastrophic. Time pressure, decision making, human factors, get-theritis. It's not something that people talk about enough, and maybe we need to talk about it more. We had a recent accident here where a bunch of children are not going to have their mothers, and there's many widows, and it's tragic. The question you have to ask yourself is it avoidable? Can anything else be done? Maybe some days you just shouldn't go fly. How bad does the weather have to be? Well, it couldn't be much worse than it was 5 days ago when these passengers were expecting to just get some fuel in Bangor and then proceed on to their business over in Europe. It's just unfortunate that it happened. Expectation bias. This is where sometimes owners provide undue pressure on pilots, and pilots don't want to disappoint their owners, so they try and see the mission through. This is not something that's talked about often enough. It's unfortunate. We've had some bad accidents in the past where expectation bias by owners compelled pilots to do things they really shouldn't try and do. We had a bad accident in Aspen, killed 18 people a long time ago. They actually allowed the owner to sit in the jump seat with the pilots while they were trying to find the airport. And it didn't go well. I think the first mistake the captain made was allowing the owner or the charter customer to sit between the pilots. Please let me know your thoughts. Is that the best idea? Letting an owner sit between you, breathing over your shoulder to try and get to your destination. It was a catastrophe in Aspen where 18 people got killed. What would you have done if you were the pilot? Would you have said, sure, come on, sit between us and let's do this together? Or would you have said, no, you need to stay in the back. I don't want you to influence my decision making. And that's really what happened. There was an influence of decision making because they allowed the owner to sit between them, breathing down their necks as they're trying to find the airport in Aspen, and it was a disaster. So continuation bias, undue pressure. Sometimes pilots place it on themselves. It's not just the owners of the aircraft. As what may have happened in Bangor, Maine, we're not going to know for a while. What I can say is it was one of the worst winter days of the year 5 days ago. Yes, aircraft were operating, but many aircraft decided not to even try and fly. But when you're transporting wealthy passengers, you don't want to disappoint them. You want to see the mission through. And did they do everything they could? We're not going to know the answers for quite a few years, but it's just unfortunate. If you were a pilot and an owner wanted to influence your decision making, would you let them? That's a question that is not talked about often enough. Self-induced pressure, that's something that's also not discussed often enough. We have several people, Paul, Apostolic Church, and I'm trying to read some of these. Make sure to put a little dirt under your pillow. Okay, some good comments there. Anyway, so unfortunate. Do we let owners influence pilots' decisions or not? It's not talked about often enough. Self-induced pressure, again, you can be a very good pilot, you can do great in your training, but if you allow yourself to be influenced by the owner of the aircraft, you don't want to upset them. It's also your job. Do you go or do you cancel? Do you want to take the risk of not continuing the flight when the weather is really bad? How bad does the weather have to be to not go? Sometimes airline companies cancel flights. Well, maybe business pilots should cancel flights more often. The recent accident in Bangor, it was a fuel stop. The aircraft didn't have enough range to go from Houston all the way to Paris, so that's why they landed where they did during one of the worst days of the year. Maybe they could have waited a day or two. Was it that important to go? Maybe. We're not going to know for a couple years. But what's not discussed often enough is the self-induced pressure that pilots face and experience when owners are breathing down their necks. It's their job on the line, perhaps, and they want to see the mission through. And that's something that no amount of training can fix. Doesn't matter how good your landings are, it doesn't matter how good your approaches are, or even what your scores are. If you're going to allow yourself to succumb to external pressures, then that puts you in an environment that could be unsafe. Did that happen in this case? We're not going to know for a couple years. But there have been other accidents, multiple other accidents, where self-induced pressure and pressure from owners pushed pilots beyond what was considered safe at the time. Would you allow a pilot to influence your decision-making? I have a question for you. Let's say you're flying from point A to point B and the weather is questionable and you're in cruise. Would you go back and let the owner know? I think that's a bad idea. In my opinion, it's better to have the decision made before you take off. Don't give them the power to influence your decisions. If you do that, then some bad things can happen. It's better to have those decisions made beforehand. And then when you land and the owner looks around and asks, why aren't we where we're supposed to go? You can tell them it was unsafe, too unsafe. So we diverted. And ultimately your job as a pilot, as a business jet pilot or an airline pilot, or even a private pilot, is to get the people from point A to point B safely. That's ultimately your goal. No amount of training, no matter how good you are as a pilot, is going to matter worth beans if people get hurt because you were influenced by an owner who was impatient, by somebody who was pushing you, or self-imposed pressure. Professional culture. Again, self-imposed pressure and pressure from owners. This is something that is part of the industry, but it's just not talked about often enough. I remember one time flying a wealthy passenger to Aspen, and the weather wasn't good. And the lady said, "We are going to Aspen." And I was kind of laughing inside because I thought to myself, if we're not safe, we're not going to Aspen. And I don't care what you're going to tell me. And it turns out it wasn't safe to continue to Aspen, and I diverted to Rifle. So as it relates to safety, you can train, you can be proficient, but that only goes so far. Human factors and self-imposed pressures are something that is not discussed often enough. Nobody wants to be inconvenienced. Well, is it worth losing your life? Here's what someone wrote: "I'll handle the cups for you, dog." I'm trying to read some of your great messaging here. I appreciate the messages, but my eyes are not the best. Anywho, human factors, what can be done as far as avoiding accidents in the winter beyond training? I mean, we have to increase the discussion of human factors and self-imposed pressure. Here's another example of self-imposed pressure: the crash in Cali, Colombia, American Airlines. They wanted to see the mission through, although they didn't know where they were. They continued to descend. They could have avoided that by just giving up the attempt to save time and inconvenience passengers and take a little extra time, wave the white flag and say, we messed up here, we need to climb and reorient ourselves. But pilots do succumb to self-imposed pressure. It's more common than you think. It's unfortunate. How do you protect yourself from a pilot who might be susceptible to self-imposed pressure? Now that's a tough one. I don't even know if you can take an exam for something like that. You could be top-notch ace and then flying into an environment which we really shouldn't be flying in at all due to self-imposed pressure, due to time constraints. Maybe the airport's closing in a couple minutes. Maybe you don't want to divert to an alternate. Maybe you have family waiting there and you just want to get there. The problem a lot of people have is they're conditioned because they drive cars. They're not usually inconvenienced. They can make it no matter how bad the weather is, usually. But it's not the same when you're flying. The stakes are a lot higher. Let me continue. So there's going to be an investigation as far as what happened in Bangor. It's going to take several years before we know what the answers are. People suspect several things. Probably was wing contamination. The weather conditions there were pretty unusual because you had warmer air above the airport and the rain that was falling actually froze as it fell into colder air. And the really treacherous thing about freezing rain is when it hits things, it's invisible. You can't really tell that your aircraft or your car or anything really has any contamination unless you run your fingers on the wing. And it was at night, and these pilots, it's really hard to tell whether an aircraft has contamination. So treacherous time to go fly. Other things are going to be analyzed as well, from weather dynamics, the performance and whatnot. This was a corporate flight. It wasn't a charter flight. This was an aircraft that was owned by one of the passengers, actually. So we'll see what happens. Let's continue. Risk management philosophy. Conservative decisions improve survival. What do you think about that? Are you willing to be inconvenienced? Are you willing to be more conservative? You might be, but is your pilot? And how do you know if they are going to be conservative when they should be? That's a question that maybe requires some testing. Delays are definitely cheaper and better than accidents, but some people don't want to be delayed. We do have procedures, they exist for a reason, but no amount of procedures work well if there are just times when you just should not fly. Assumptions are super dangerous in winter ops. The margins are reduced substantially. When I was flying the 777, one of the things I liked the most about it was I didn't have to expose myself to risk. It was great to fly just one leg from point A to point B, because every time you descend and land, you are exposing yourself to additional risk. And that was a great thing about having extra long range. You're not exposing yourself to additional risk. It's just statistics. That's all. It's just statistics. The more you put yourself in situations where you are exposing yourself to risk, the likelihood of something happening goes up. Maybe some of you have been in car accidents. Has anyone been in a fender bender? It's statistics. Have you been in any car accidents? It's statistics. It's not really considered risky because it's a normal part of everyday life. In flying, we have lots of regulatory compliance, we have training, we have good maintenance. We have a lot of different things that have to be followed and complied with to make sure that you get home to your loved ones. But sometimes even that isn't enough. It requires a little common sense. So how do you communicate that, or how do you extract that from a pilot who might be a top-notch ace, but you don't really know if they're going to succumb to self-induced pressure? On it, for example, what happened last week when they had to get fuel and it was horrendous. The conditions were not great. And they continued anyway, when maybe they should have waited. Some airliners did not go. They actually went back to the gate and they said, we're not even going to bother doing this. So how can we become a better and safer aviation industry? Please include your questions here and let me know. Every accident reminds us to double check and to avoid what has happened to others. We don't want to repeat the accidents of the past. The regulation book when I started aviation over 40 years ago was narrow. It's gotten a lot thicker because there have been a lot of accidents since then. So we have more and more restrictions. What can we do? What do you think we can do to make pilots safer as it comes to avoiding or succumbing to really bad weather conditions where maybe you shouldn't fly? Is there a test that a pilot can take? Is there an examination that a pilot should take so that they don't succumb to self-induced pressure to go? I mentioned the Aspen crash years ago. The captain allowed the lead passenger to sit with the pilots, which I thought was a terrible idea. And that added to the self-induced pressure to land and make it to a dinner engagement, and it didn't go down well at all. They crashed, they all passed away. And it all could have been avoided if certain things were done, like not lying when you're talking to air traffic control and saying you have the runway when you don't. We have rules that exist for a reason, but if you're going to break the rules, are the passengers paying you to get there? Are they paying you to not be safe? Ultimately, it's all about being safer. And that's the goal at the end of the day. We learn from facts, not from rumors. There's already a lot of people who have surmised why that accident happened in Bangor. It's going to take a couple years, probably more than a couple months, a couple years. We need to just be patient. Aviation improves through transparency. Professionalism means acting like a professional and admitting when you make mistakes. But sometimes that's hard for some professionals to do. Safety is built on discipline. What's an example of good discipline? Not flying when you shouldn't. Respecting the margins that are out there. Respecting the process. When you've been hired to fly an airline, or when you're hired to fly jet charter, I did jet charter for years, there are some days I couldn't go because it just wasn't safe. Was it going to disappoint the passengers? Yeah, it was. But ultimately, at the end of the day, my job is to keep you safe. I want to get you back to your family, to your children. And no amount of money is going to motivate me to take any risks, because I want to get back to my family as well. Accident investigations are about learning. We've learned a lot from past accidents, and we're going to learn a lot from this last one too. It was unfortunate that it happened. I do want to discuss a clean wing concept. Some people suspect that the wings on this aircraft were contaminated. What does that mean? That means that the smooth airflow over the wing was not occurring because there was precipitation, frozen precipitation maybe, on the wings. And that will negatively impact how the aircraft will operate. It may have a much higher stalling speed. We're just not going to know for several years. Some people think, well, if I have contamination on my jet, I'll just rotate faster. Doesn't necessarily work. Even if you rotate a lot faster, you become a test pilot. Do you really want to be a test pilot with passengers in the back? I don't think so. So margins shrink quickly as winter operations take place. With the accident that happened 5 days ago, marginal visibility, a contaminated runway. Precipitation was falling. De-icing procedures were in effect. And there was something else that a lot of people may not understand. Even if an aircraft is de-iced, that means they spray all of that protection on the wings and the body of the aircraft. That is not sufficient sometimes. Sometimes when the precipitation is dangerous enough, the holdover time, which means the amount of time you have to actually take off after they are done applying it, might be very little time, very little time. This particular aircraft had to taxi about a mile just to take off, and that takes time. And every second that aircraft is taxiing, there's that precipitation that's changing, possibly changing the character of the wing. Is that what happened? We're not going to know. We're just going to have to wait and find out, but it's not a guarantee. I can tell you that several airliners that were de-iced made some tactile checks with their fingers, and guess what? They went back to the gate. They didn't go. Speculation doesn't improve safety. I'm not here to speculate. I'm here to promote safety and just discuss human factors. Human factors is something we've all dealt with. I think we have all at some point driven a car, maybe when we were more tired than we should have been for driving, and we continued to drive. I'm guilty of that. I wanted to get home. I don't think there's a driver out there who hasn't driven when they were tired. That's an example of get-there-itis. That's an example of human factors. However, when you're in an airplane, get-there-itis can be really dangerous. Get-there-itis is when it doesn't matter how bad the conditions might be, you're going to keep charging ahead. And we've lost a lot of pilots and a lot of passengers as a result of get-there-itis. The professional term is continuation bias. It's the same thing. Your bias to get to your destination is impacting your sound judgment. Sound judgment kind of goes by the wayside because you just want to see the completion of what you want, even if it's not necessarily safe. So what do you think? Let me read some of your comments here. I see some votes for Trump. You guys are funny. As a matter of fact, Trump's Air Force One actually had to come back last week because there was an electrical anomaly. And that was prudent that they did that. All aircraft have, not all, but most, minimum equipment lists. This allows them to operate even when certain things fail. But it seemed like it was serious enough that they decided to turn around, and they did. And that's a good thing. Let's continue with this discussion for just a couple more minutes. We're discussing safety concepts. How does aviation become safer? What do you think can be done to make aviation safer as it relates to human factors and that pilots don't push the edge and people get hurt? Is there a test that has to be created? Is there an examination pilots have to take? What needs to be created so that pilots don't push the envelope and that people die? Is there something else that has to be developed? Training only goes so far. You can be the most Top Gun pilot in the world, and even if you're a great pilot, that doesn't necessarily mean you have great judgment if you're susceptible to self-induced pressure. Do we need to create an examination for pilots' susceptibility to self-induced pressure? The other accident that I discussed was Aspen years ago. 18 people died. The captain allowed the owner to sit between them, and they were influenced by the owner wanting to land in Aspen, and the weather was not good at all. In my opinion, it was a bad idea that the pilots allowed the lead passenger to sit between them to try and get into Aspen. That was a crazy thing that they did. I never would have recommended it. I also don't recommend, if you're a pilot, that you even let the paying passengers know if you're going to need to divert. That's a decision that should be made before you even take off. The worst thing you can do is have a committee while the aircraft's on autopilot, because the owner's just, or the charter customer is going to say, yeah, I just want to get to my destination. sometimes it's better just to have the decision made before you ever take off. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you just want to be safe, and you want to make sure they're safe as well, because you want to get back home to your families. When we talk about contamination for aircraft and the types of fluids that remove that contamination, we have something called type. It's heated and it's sprayed on the whole aircraft, and it melts any contamination that might be on the aircraft. And then afterwards, they spray something called type 4. Type 4 is kind of a glycol type of fluid that sits on top of the wings of aircraft. And it's designed to resist the change in the upper surface of the airfoil for a given amount of time, depending on the type of precipitation that's falling. If it's light snow, sometimes your holdover time, in other words, the time that you can actually be there before takeoff, might be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, even 20 minutes, and you're still safe to go. If it's moderate snow, the protection time is going to go down. Your holdover time is going to go way down substantially. If it's heavy snow, your holdover time is going to go down even more. So it really just depends on the type of precipitation. It's not a guarantee that you can go. If you have super dangerous precipitation like freezing rain, your holdover time is almost non-existent because of the type of precipitation that it is. It might just be a couple of minutes. Sometimes when an aircraft has to taxi a mile, like this aircraft did 5 days ago, it takes more than just a couple minutes just to take off, and the holdover time might have expired for this crew. We're just not going to know. Freezing rain is probably one of the worst types of precipitation you can fly in. I can tell you from experience that when it strikes an aircraft, you can't tell that the wing shape has changed. But when you run your fingers on the top of the wing, you can definitely tell because it's not smooth. And that's what's really dangerous about freezing rain. So regarding de-icing fluid concepts, they're only as good as the recommendations, but you need to follow the recommendations of the type 1 and the type 4 fluid. One time I was taken off out of Boston in a Learjet, and they only had type 1 fluid. Type 1 fluid doesn't give you any holdover time at all. It just melts and removes all of the contamination that's on your aircraft. The good news for us was it wasn't snowing. If it had been snowing, then I would have had a problem. I really wouldn't have been able to go because if the snow was falling and getting on the wing, I didn't have any type 4 fluid to buy me any time. But because it wasn't snowing, it was safe for me to go. And I was surprised. Boston in the wintertime, Bedford, Massachusetts, actually that's where I was. You really don't have type 4 fluid? I was shocked. I was shocked. But I was able to depart safely. De-icing fluid is something that provides a way to fly, but not always. There were a couple of airliners that received it at the same time that this aircraft did last week, and they did a tactile check, and guess what? They went back to the gate. They did their tactile check, and they said no go. So it's not a guarantee. Let me continue. Human factors. Time pressure is one of the most dangerous human factors that a pilot can face. And it's something that's not discussed often enough. We all have human factors that we deal with even when we're driving. We want to get home. We want to get to our families. We want to get home from work. But typically in a car, you'll make it most of the time. Sometimes in an airplane, you won't. Professional culture must override urgency. Are you being professional by canceling? I would say absolutely. You tell me. Are you being professional by canceling a trip? Even if you're driving, occasionally, like in Texas during the summer, there might be some times where you just shouldn't go. And that's what we're really talking about. Are you going to allow self-induced pressure to have you go, or are you going to stay and make sure everybody stays safe? Here's another example of where self-induced pressure costs lives. Many years ago, there was a very young girl who was trying to fly across the country with her dad and a flight instructor, and the weather conditions were not great. And they really shouldn't have taken off, but they did, and they all got killed. That's another example of trying to meet a schedule, trying to meet a certain deadline, and it costs lives. It's just not worth it. What can we do to improve aviation safety? That's my question. Is there an examination that needs to be developed to see which pilots are susceptible to self-induced pressure? Or if an owner says, okay, I want you to get me there today, and you're like, am I going to do this or aren't I? Wouldn't you like to know, especially if you're a passenger, whether the pilot is susceptible to something like that? I think that's an examination that needs to be developed in the industry. We have very good testing and simulator training and all these other things, but we're lacking as it relates to having an exam or a test that tests pilots' susceptibility to self-induced pressure or pressure from others. Winter's standard operating procedure means we certainly operate with the limitations that we have in front of us. We try in worse weather conditions, we try not to take risks. That's why there's so much training, there's so much checking, there's so many examinations, there's even a medical that has to be taken once or twice per year. A lot of money is spent to ensure your safety and mine. But even that isn't enough sometimes due to human factors like self-induced pressure. If you like this, let me know. Comment, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you here.